Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Eric Jones, and I'm your law enforcement person. I think you will hear from maybe one or two others. So I wanted to give you a public safety perspective to the discussion. So why do I have any legitimacy on this topic to you? It's because we deployed some technology in the city where I was police chief, and lessons learned on how we could have done it better, on rolling it out to our community to make sure that the community viewed what we were doing as legitimate. So a quick background about me. I spent 30 years prior to my current position in Sacramento County, 30 years in Stockton, California. Does anybody know where Stockton is? A few hands, okay. So I actually became chief there in 2012. And that was when I would describe it as the negative trifecta of things going on. Number one, we had the highest violent crime rate our city had ever seen, 71 homicides in 1 year, and Stockton's not that big to have 71 homicides. It's about 300,000. So not just statewide, but across the nation, one of the highest violent crime rates. Also during that time, we were going through bankruptcy. So prior to Detroit, the city of Stockton was the largest American city to declare bankruptcy. The third intersect was our staffing issue. We actually had huge layoffs and an exodus of officers who left the department. And so there was a moment there in 2012 where we were the second most understaffed police department in the entire nation per capita. So again, not even accounting for the violent crime things. Also, we had some of the lowest trust of our community trust within their police department. We had a couple controversial shootings. So we had a lot of work to do, as you can see. So the reason I say these things are during all of this time, we actually became more engaged with the community and brought on some technologies to help us with our work, especially, for example, to do the violent crime issue. We did predictive analytics, predictive policing applied to gun violence, which this vendor who we use there had never done it before for violent crime, for gun crime, and had for property crimes, burglaries, things like that, but actually using predictive analytics and algorithms to forecast, if you will, where violent crime was going to occur, so we would then deploy police officers in those regions. It was free to us, not that they felt sorry for us for all of those negative trifecta factors I told you. Perhaps that they knew that we were a city in bankruptcy, so we needed help. But also they saw it as an opportunity to apply their technology in our community there in the city of Stockton. So learned a few things over the years, which was that there is a significant difference between safety and security, and the way that our communities feel about it, the way you feel about it, the way I feel about it. So like I said, lessons learned. We rolled out some many technologies during that time, license plate readers, drones, surveillance cameras, and some of them we should have received community input in a much more meaningful way than we did. So again, we learned from that. Now with the predictive analytics for gun violence, we were deploying resources, temporal, right, time, day of the week, time of night, geographic, which locations, how many officers to deploy into those areas to try to give a proactive, visible police presence to see if it had any bearing on actually reducing the gun crime. And the short answer is it did. It was very successful. However, we know which communities we were deploying these resources into. They were our communities of color. And we used many buckets of data to deploy resources in those areas. Weather, certain times of year, certain areas tend to have more crime, which gangs or groups are more active at any given time. The most real-time data we were able to use in a lot of different factors. And so we were viewed, though, as an occupying force within those neighborhoods. So, what I learned, we actually became part of a national initiative for building community trust and justice. We were one of 6 pilot cities in the United States. Largest study ever done looking at American policing and what really drives community mistrust within their police departments, government, for what we're talking about here over these couple days. So what we learned is the community really just wanted a voice in how they were policed. Not that they didn't want to be policed, and I hate to use that term, but we all know what I'm referencing, but a voice in how they are. So if officers are going to be deployed on data within their neighborhoods, they want to have a say in how those officers are going to interact with community members. Because we did see that the racial disparities did spike. And we know there are a lot of racial disparities in the criminal justice system. They absolutely exist. The question is, well, number one, do they exist? I think we all know the answer, yes, they do. And they're among all parts of the system. Police, arresting, through incarceration, through the courts, through sentencing, right, through the entire process. And so we know they exist. Where do they exist? And then the why. And the why is the very, very difficult part that I hope that this emerging technology can help us with over time. So again, getting a voice into the way we deploy these various technologies I mentioned, not just a forum, not just a town hall, right? Those are checkoffs, or they can be viewed as that, right? They're one-time things. No, it's an ongoing advisory board with many members of the community, listening sessions, where the community members, individuals are actually assisting the department with policy, meaningful policy change. And a lot of this has to start internally within the police department, the government, whichever it is that's dealing with the safety and security of the community. And I use an acronym Plato, not the stuff you mess with, but the philosopher, right? Plato, which is policy, leadership, accountability, training, and oversight. Those are 5 pieces to actually have meaningful deployment of, let's say, technology in a community. And transparency, that's important too. We actually learned through our failures of predictive policing and not explaining it to the community before doing the deployment. So we really learned that through something we called CityStat, all of the data we were using, we did it public facing also. Because, well, not all of it, but I mean, obviously the confidential things, the things with gang issues. But as far as just the data, we deployed that, or we publicly faced that out of a need for transparency. And we did something called, what we called principled policing. And I think this kind of cuts across a lot of what we're talking about as well for whatever officials or government might be using any technology. It's about why do we do what we do. And Robert Peel from the UK, probably about 100 years ago, it's called the Peeling Principles, apply today just like they did back then in the 1800s. Police are a part of the community, not apart from the community, right? And that's what principled policing is ensuring that the community, all members have a voice, and the technologies, the policing strategies that will be and are being deployed within their neighborhoods. So I'll just finish with the difference as I see it between safety and security. You may have your own definition in your head probably right now of what these two words are, but the way I feel it applies is security is about protection against threats. And often it is about officials who are really imposing what they feel those protections should be based on their expertise. That's what security is. Safety is a personal feeling of being free from harm or danger. And that harm can be from anybody, anything, any system, and it could be officials in government creating harms, maybe unintentionally, based on a technology that they're rolling out. So I think it's important for us when we're thinking of safety, it's shared public safety, which means everybody has a voice in how their community is going to have law enforcement applied within their neighborhoods. So with that, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much, and I want to make way now for your next panel. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for sticking with us through today so far. I'm the FT's tech correspondent based out of San Francisco. I'm very excited to introduce our next panel, Deploying AI for Safer Communities, which as a journalist is a nice, juicy topic. We've already heard in the last panel that I moderated, someone raised Minority Report and did all the scaremongering that evokes. But there's a huge difference in vision and execution between policing for security and policing to promote public safety. We've gathered here at the forum as partners in the pursuit of the ethical deployment of AI in furtherance of healthy democracies. And with that in mind, our panel session today will examine the dangers of deploying AI without appropriate accountability. We'll also explore a case study of public-private partnership in the criminal justice space and learn about a new approach to holding the police accountable for inequitable enforcement. Joining me here today, we have Carolina Caeiro, the Senior Internet Policy Specialist at the Oxford Information Labs. Ishanu, let me try this. Do you want to try it?
Chattopadhyay.
There we go. Assistant Professor of Medicine and Data Science at the University of Chicago, and Neal, Parikh, who served as the first Director of Artificial Intelligence for New York City. Please join me in welcoming them all. Carolina, let's start with you. In your 2022 paper on facial recognition in Latin America, you focused on the deployment and impact of biometric technologies in Buenos Aires and Sao Paulo. Tell us a bit about the common trends that you observed between those cities.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you for the opportunity of being here. So indeed, I did look at two case studies. One was in the city of Buenos Aires, which is the capital of Argentina, where we saw the city police deploy a live facial recognition program. And just to sort of be clear, this was not a pilot like we've seen happen in other cities, but a full-on program where essentially the police run video footage collected through the public transport system in the city, and biometric data of passengers was sort of vetted against criminal databases provided by the police. And this one specific program that I looked at as one of my case studies was actually discontinued in 2022 after a court found there were irregularities with how it was running, the number of searches that were conducted, and that included allegations of the system being misused to essentially track political figures and human rights activists. The second case study that I looked at was a deployment in the city of Sao Paulo. It was actually a pilot run by the state police of Sao Paulo in the city of Sao Paulo during the carnival celebrations. And it was basically sort of a similar case study to the one in Buenos Aires, in that we saw the deployment of live facial recognition, and again, the sort of vetting against police database of wanted criminals. And I will say, to sort of finalize providing the context, when you look at Latin America, there's a total of 8 countries that either have deployments or are piloting the technology for policing, 4 countries that are looking into using facial recognition for policing as well, and 2 that are suspected of using the technology and just not being transparent about it. So that's a lot of countries. It's almost 70% of countries in Latin America, including some authoritarian-leaning countries that are looking to use the technology. So going right to your question about the trends I identified in the paper. So essentially looking at these two case studies, there were sort of multiple common trends that came through. Things like the technology being procured through obscure, non-transparent procurement processes. the fact that the technologies were deployed without sort of the proper oversight mechanisms in place. But there were two that I wanted to actually sort of raise and discuss, bring to the panel. One that I think may resonate with colleagues here in the US, and that one has to do with the fact that in these two case studies I looked at, the deployments of facial recognition technologies for policing relied on the use of police databases that in some way reinforced structural discrimination. I think that, oftentimes when we speak about the risk of AI, reinforcing structural discrimination, we end up speaking about algorithmic bias, right? Mm-hmm. And that kind of sits with the people that develop the technology. But when you see these deployments, in the context of policing, you add sort of a layer of complexity when, police forces bring in, their databases of wanted criminals, which in the case of, Argentina and Brazil, I think, reflect the sort of disproportionate criminalization of individuals based on race and income level. So just to sort of bring this down to earth, in the case of Buenos Aires, the list of wanted criminals that the police was, running through the system included people that were sought after for petty crime, so things like, stealing a purse, right? So that, when you run a system, a facial recognition system using that kind of database, you're, basically reinforcing criminalization of minor offenders, for example. And in the case of Brazil, there was very little information about the database of wanted criminals that was used, but there was this study by Brazil's network of security observatories that looked at pilots, facial recognition pilots conducted in 5 states across Brazil, and 90% of arrests resulting from the pilots involved Black Brazilians. So I think, that tells us sort of a lot, I think, about the potential of this technology to sort of amplify discriminatory biases that are built into these databases. And the second trend that I'll mention very briefly, as to not take a lot more time, is that in both these deployments, there were no human rights assessments conducted prior the technology being rolled out. And I often get asked by people like, human rights assessments, like, why are they that important? And I always say they're really, really, really important because they really get to sort of the heart of the legality of the deployments themselves, and whether the way that you're intending to deploy the technology will be human rights respecting, whether it will be in alignment with civil rights enshrined in local legislation. So it's a very sort of great sort of starter point to make sure that whatever you deploy is something reasonable.
So this is not just algorithmic bias, but the sort of systemic bias in those databases around that. So 2 layers there.
Absolutely.
And you're talking about examples of where sort of what can happen when the technology is deployed without accountability structures in place. So sort of where do we go from here safely? Is it possible to unring the bell, given that some of these projects are already out there in the open?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a very difficult question, but one that I think we need to be trying to answer. I always tell people when I speak about this paper that the way I summarize it is, to me, Latin America is in a worst case scenario in the sense that the technology is deployed without the adequate safeguards. So, the question is, where do we go from here, right? And, when you speak, for instance, to civil society colleagues across Latin America, a lot of them will, basically advocate for full ban of facial recognition for policing. And there's very strong arguments for, sort of supporting full-out bans in the context of Latin America. First, there's, this risk of the technologies exacerbating inequalities and structural discrimination. Latin America is the most unequal continent in the world. And we also have a past of recent military dictatorships. So for Latin Americans, ensuring that public spaces are free of surveillance is, particularly important. But at the same time, I always say it's very difficult to put the genie back in the bottle, right? Because these technologies, are out there being used. So what I argue is a more sort of feasible way forward is actually focusing on revisiting the impact of facial recognition technologies deployed in the region and develop the proper safeguards. And I think we've been discussing a lot safeguards, guardrails over the last couple of sessions, and I do want to offer some sort of concrete examples of what that means, because we're sort of throwing that out there and it's like, well, what is a safeguard, right? So in the case of facial recognition technologies for policing, safeguards entail things like having oversight mechanisms over the institutions that are in charge of conducting or deploying the technologies. It means offering opportunities for redress in cases of discriminatory uses or wrongful detentions, actually, which were really prominent in the case of Buenos Aires. And also opening data on the performance of the system so we can have a conversation about whether they're even effective in the first place. So I'll leave it at that, I think. Thank you.
I think we should definitely return to the question of the guardrails and what exactly they look like.
Right.
But you mentioned facial recognition. I've been thinking about it from the perspective of the social media platforms that I cover from Silicon Valley, who are obviously working out what they do with it, as well as the kind of governmental side. Neal, you were the inaugural AI director for New York City. Part of your work was to craft the city's strategy for AI. Can you talk to us a bit about that?
Sure, and thanks for having me. So essentially, the backstory of this was that the city, New York City, had various initiatives over the previous number of years that were addressing certain subsets of things related to AI or things that were sort of adjacent. So for instance, we heard from a former director of this office called MODA, the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics. So that was created. There was a Mayor's Office of Information Privacy and a position like a Chief Privacy Officer of the city that was created. There was an executive order creating regrettably named title the AMPO, which essentially was in charge of putting together an AI registry for the city. So these are all of the different applications of AI that impact residents across all of the different agencies. And that's a public report that gets put out every year or two. And you can look at these online. But these were sort of looking at very specific things. So there was a desire to step back and take a very holistic look at AI and how it affects not just the city government, but New York City's ecosystem as a whole. So that was kind of the impetus of this. And I'll just run through briefly. And if you want to read it, you can just Google NYC AI strategy and it will come up. There are sort of 7 components of it, and I'll run through them quickly. So one is that the audience for this was really city leaders, and that included senior people within the city government, agency commissioners, deputy commissioners, technical leaders, et cetera, but also a lot of the kinds of people that are represented in this audience that are, nonprofit advocates, business leaders, others that deal with the government or deal with policy. So it's a public document, but it's not really targeted at the general public. So one part of this was just setting a baseline of understanding of how AI actually works. So there's a thing we call the AI primer. This is not specific to NYC in any way. This is sort of how do AI projects actually get put together? And then now that you understand that at some level of detail, where do these ethics, policy, governance questions actually come from? If we're talking about bias, how does that actually happen? To sort of ground the conversation. So there's this sort of educational component. Second component was sort of ecosystem mapping. So these are all of the different agencies across the government that deal with AI in some facet or another. Some of them are doing economic development, some of them are doing policies, some of them use it, all sorts of things. And also across the city itself, so not specific to the government. So we did this sort of ecosystem mapping exercise. Then we sort of tried to lay out 5 different components of AI, which often get dealt with by different people in isolation, but they interact. So we wanted to, provide that sort of conceptual framework for people, policymakers, and others that were thinking about this. So these were, some of them are technical and some of them are not. So there was data infrastructure, which is a prerequisite for AI, as we've heard, but not specific to AI. So there's data infrastructure, there's city applications. These are places where the city actually uses AI for something or the other, and profiling a couple of case studies. There's policy and governance, both within the government's own use and in the private sector. There's partnerships, which we wanted to highlight. So multi-sector partnerships are critical for actually getting a lot of this to work effectively. And then the last is business, education, and the workforce. So sort of labor, business, economic development, things like that. So that's how it's organized, and it's really trying to set a conceptual framework for this. And I think a week or two ago, the current administration, this was under the previous administration, so the current administration just released an AI action plan, which is kind of part 2 of this, that is building on that and then laying out particular action items.
Can you talk a little more about the project that you worked on, as I understand, that was a sort of multi-sector collaboration that harnessed AI for positive outcomes?
Yeah, so this is one in criminal justice. This is actually not my project, so that I don't want to take credit for it. It's one that what we were trying to do in the section that I referred to on case studies of where the city actually uses this stuff. We wanted to find qualitatively different case studies because you can't govern these things the same way. Some of them, there's a cyber defense agency. This is an autonomous system that doesn't have a human in the loop. It runs hundreds of thousands of times a second all the time. That's a very different sort of setting than this criminal justice thing I'll talk about. So we're trying to lay out a bunch of these different applications to show the diversity. So this was a project that was done actually in partnership with the New York branch of the University of Chicago Crime Lab, which is one of the urban labs that Margot Pritzker referred to yesterday. But I'll just run through some of the key aspects of this project because they're very instructive for how to do one of these things well. So first, this is about something called pretrial risk assessment. This is basically before the person has their court date, decide whether the person is held in jail or whether they're allowed to go home and you expect them to actually show up for their court date or not. If they don't, it's something called failure to appear. So you want to make sure that people show up for their court dates. But a lot of people were being held in Rikers Island, which is not a nice place, that didn't need to be there because they haven't been convicted of anything yet, right? So this is the premise of it. So first they started with a policy goal that what we want to do is we want to get people out of jail that do not need to be there, and we want to reduce racial disparities in the system. So this is not a project about efficiency or anything like that. It's trying to affect a criminal justice policy objective. It has nothing to do with AI per se. They just used AI to do this. Then they partnered with people. So they partnered with the crime lab and some other outside folks. They put together independent interdisciplinary teams. There were 2 separate teams of researchers that each had a mix of sort of machine learning people, criminologists, et cetera, et cetera. Then they had a very participatory process. They spent years interviewing judges, defense lawyers, the DA, the defendants, all kinds of people in the system to get feedback and sort of design it accordingly. Then they had these sort of 2 different teams that built independent models, sort of red team each other for robustness purposes. Then they did things because of certain constraints in the court system, this model is actually designed to be ultra transparent and contestable. You actually run this model on paper. So it's designed to be run by hand. So both sides, both the lawyer, both the prosecutor and the defense attorney can look at the inputs. And there's 8 inputs. It's a very small model on purpose. And you can say things like, this person had 2 prior offenses, not 3. And then you can hand recalculate it in court to get a different assessment. There is a human in the loop. This is advisory for the judge, right? And the information presentation, because essentially what the output of this thing is the probability the person shows up. The way they presented this to the judge, because there's all kinds of behavioral science things about how people interpret probabilities and misinterpret them. So they were very careful in how this was presented. And then they checked that it worked. So they, once they rolled this out, they actually monitored it carefully. And they've gotten thousands and thousands of people out of jail that did not need to be there through the use of this system and reduced racial disparities while keeping the rate of court appearance fixed. So it's a really kind of amazing project with a lot of positive impact and something very important. But I think it's also a very good template for how to do one of these projects and what can go into it. It took several years to do this, even though it's a tiny little model. And this is all completely documented. You can read reports, you can see the model, you can see the weights, you can see everything online.
Did you have a sense from looking into this of how they were sure that it was fair on the sort of the output side?
Well, the way is that, I mean, sometimes the way people talk about algorithmic fairness is that it's something sort of incidental, that you are trying to make this thing more efficient. If you designed the same model with the same data, right, and you said, I'm trying to predict what the judge is going to do, or if this person is going to end up getting sent to jail versus sent home, then you will end up with some racist thing, because that's the sort of historical data and all of that. With exactly the same data, you will end up with something like this because of the way you formulated the question. Here they approached it with this policy objective that the whole point of the thing is to reduce racial disparities. So it's not just that it's fair, it's beyond fair in a way, because it's trying to actively reduce the racial disparities, not just sort of keep them where they were. And you can do this in all kinds of different things where you're trying to improve some historical kind of inequity as opposed to just not make it worse.
Right, so you sort of have to make sure this technology is carefully deployed, but also that you've identified sort of any deeper systemic issues that need to be addressed as you're deploying it.
Absolutely, and you need policy people at the table. These are not technical decisions. You know, this is something that came from the criminal justice people that they were trying to do.
Thanks, Neal.
Yeah.
Ishanu, let's turn to you. I read that research that you published in August 2022 in the Nature Human Behavior combines data from 8 major US cities to illustrate the systemic discrimination tied to socioeconomic status that occurs in policing in the US. Can you tell us a bit more about that research and what you learned?
Yeah, sure. So my background is in machine learning. I'm like the guy who designs some of those algorithms. So I'm not a social scientist. So going into that work, the idea was less like trying to come up with the next best predictive policing algorithm, but more into like trying to understand how law enforcement, like criminal events, the social structure in a city, how they kind of interact, and can we better understand it? What is the best model of that we can come up with? The idea was to really build a digital twin of this complex interaction. So that was one of the goals. The other was trying to see if I can teach machines to look for bias in data. That'd be great, right? That kind of might help with some of these problems. The second question, the first one, both these were hard, but the second one was a bit harder in the sense that it's not clear what do we actually mean by bias. I mean, we intuitively understand that, but when you're trying to make a machine run an algorithm, compute something, what do you need to compute to come up with a notion of bias? Like, what exactly is it? For example, if there is more enforcement and in a place where there's more crime, is that bias? Maybe not. We don't know. So that's not a good answer, right? What is that clear signature of bias that we can actually compute from data? That's where that came from. We actually found one, but we found that if instead of what predictive policing algorithms have done historically, that they have just tried to come up with a prediction or come up with hotspots, right? And they don't work really well, if you ask me. They don't really work very well. They've not been validated to actually contribute in bringing down crime. None of that actually has been shown. But more so, crime doesn't really work like that. It's not like if your house is broken into today, the odds of your house being broken into tomorrow, it's probably lower. It's not the same or not higher. So it's not really like a hotspot. It's not like effect kind of diffusing out. So you really have to model all of these things together. You really have to model how crime is happening, what is the law enforcement response, what's the social topology of the city, right? So where the bus routes are, where the train routes are. All of this kind of things make it unique. You cannot take a model that works in Chicago and take it and apply it to New York City. It's basically pretty unique from one place to another. So all these complexities are there. But once you're able to do it, once you're able to build this kind of a digital twin so that you can then see or experiment with different kinds of inputs, you can kind of tweak or increase the crime rate in some parts of a city. You can reduce it in some parts of a city. You can change policing policies. And since you have this the whole model, which is pretty accurate in your computer, you can see how they all interact, right? Now, clearly, this is not a simple thing. It cannot be a simple model by definition. If you're trying to kind of put in place how law enforcement responses interact with crime, with the complexities of a particular city, it cannot be simple. There's no way it will be simple, right? So our model has literally, I don't remember right now exactly, but about a 250 million parameters. So it's a very large model. Just like, I want to say this, but that's just like ChatGPT has like billions of parameters. So it's a complex model. And it needs to be complex because you're modeling a complex system, that's one. And the predictive part, and we were able to predict events really well, that kind of appeared as a secondary effect. Because if you want to understand how this dynamics, how all these properties, these artifacts interact and shape how these events appear in space and time, you have to be able, if you have a system that does that, then by definition, you are able to predict what's going to happen. That was not the objective, but that is required to be able to do this. But what happens because of that is you can do these experiments. You can see what happens if you increase the crime in some parts, decrease the crime in some parts. And what we found that in more well-off neighborhoods, if you increase the crime, if you stress the system, the law enforcement reacts kind of in proportion. The arrest rate kind of tracks how the crime is going up. But the total resources is conserved in most times, which means that that is maintained, that level is maintained by drawing away resources from less wealthy or less well-off neighborhoods. So basically what we see is as you tweak up the crime, the arrest rate or the law enforcement response tracks in well-off neighborhoods and kind of crashes. The arrest rate kind of crashes in poorer neighborhoods. That's not a good thing. It's not that I'm saying that the wealthy neighborhoods are being over-policed and the poorer neighborhoods are under-policed. No, that's not what's going on. What's going on is that there is what we saw evidence for, and we see that replicated not just in Chicago, but in 8 other cities, is that there is essentially an inequity in resource allocation. Particularly when there's resource constraints, the way resources are being moved around, that is clearly kind of, there's a bias in the allocation. So that's where it kind of comes in and closes the loop. Also, since you brought up Minority Report, it's kind of interesting. This is what's stated in the paper, this is in the title of the paper itself, but still people kind of mostly interpreted it as, oh, we have Minority Report, and someone actually tweeted the paper to Tom Cruise.
Oh, really?
He didn't reply, but
is the inverse true in if crime goes up in
yes,
less affluent neighborhoods? It's very hard.
That's a very good question. So it's very hard from data to figure out causal links, right? How do you? I mean, this is like Stat 101. Like correlation is not causation. So can we at all ever figure out causality? I mean, not really. It gets into philosophical things, not really. But we can get close. So one of those things would be that. At least that have to be there, that it goes up with that, comes down with that, and whenever you perturb it in weird ways, those things track, right? So.
Were there any other surprises or any other trends you found from sort of tweaking the
that was kind of interesting. I don't know whether, let me still talk about that. It's not in the paper. This was some stuff we left out of the paper because we knew it would be controversial. The authors actually got hate mail when the paper came out. I didn't realize that it was that kind of touchy, but it was. So we left out some of the things. So we also looked at if you do the same analysis for terrorism, right, at a global scale instead of doing it for crime at the city level. What happens if you look at a global scale? The time scale and the spatial scale becomes larger. You're not looking at in terms of city blocks, you're looking in terms of maybe cities or square miles and stuff like that. What do they, like, is there any difference between crime, maybe even violent crime, and terrorism? And we found, interestingly, there is one. And this is unpublished work, so there is a difference. The difference is that the crime, in urban crime, tends to have a more equilibrium. It's like when crime goes down, it tends to come back. The rates tend to go up. If it goes up, there is a corrective feature. Whereas in terrorism, it's an unstable system. And if you think about it, we were very excited about this, but still decided not to put it in the paper, is that it makes sense. I mean, if someone is a criminal, it's not in their best interest to destroy the city. There'll be no one to mug at that point, no one to rob. Not very useful. Whereas if for a terrorist the idea is to blow up everything. So that's we can actually see that in the data, and that's kind of very exciting.
Interesting. So we've sort of spoken about using AI to uncover bias, but then also the fears that AI can replicate human bias, and also the systems around it may lead to bias. So can we talk a bit more about those guardrails that Carolina mentioned? How do you think about those?
So this was very interesting to listen to both Carolina and Neal. So as you guys know, I mean, predictive policing, I don't know who was the first one. I don't want to misquote it, but Pred Poll was probably one of the earlier first things. I actually know Jeff Brettingham. And Chicago has tried this quite a few times. Now they have probably decided not to try it that much, but they have been trying predictive policing with AI quite a few times. And in my opinion, it's just my opinion, they're not the right approach. For example, the latest iteration of Chicago's approach was to make a list, trying to figure out if a particular individual would be a perpetrator or a victim of gun violence, and then try to intervene at individual level. That's a bad idea, and the list was secret. They used some simple equation to come up with that names in that list, and the list was secret. All of this is terrible. This is a terrible idea, right? First of all, having a simple equation to boil down that somebody's going to be a victim or a perpetrator of crime, which has real consequences, they can go to jail, is bad, first. Second, keeping the list secret is just terrible. And when the list was finally revealed, it had like 51% of the black male population on the list. So it was and this is what's going to happen. Anyone kind of thinking about it rationally would have seen this was going to happen. So what we did, and we were aware of all of this, right? Pred Poll had some other issues, in my opinion, again. It's like crime doesn't really spread out like a diffusing system. You have to take into account the topology of the city. But what we kind of try to do differently is to keep it completely open. So in our approach, no one is sitting down figuring out what are the features that we should put in that should drive crime. First of all, it's not based on individuals. We're not trying to predict if a particular individual is going to commit crime or be a victim of crime. It is almost always, or it is not. We are instead trying to look at this as events appearing in space and time and how to predict that. But more so, no one is sitting down trying to figure out what the features are. That's not a thing. It's all automated. We're letting data tell the story. That's one. And both the algorithm and the data is open source. So anyone here can actually take the algorithm, spin up some virtual machines on Google Cloud, and run the algorithm. So there's nothing that is secret. And I think that's, in my opinion, that might help to go a lot in that direction. And I want to add that the points that Carolina brought up, that is really, really important, right? How do we can't put the genie back in the box, that's true, but what do we do with this AI thing? I mean, it brings out all these capabilities that the state can use to surveil people. It actually kind of brings us closer to the Orwellian reality, right? I mean, is there an escape from that? I think the way to have an escape from that is to democratize AI, to have algorithms like one of the things that we reported. It is kind of can be used by anyone and everyone. And it can be turned, the tables can be turned so that it is not only applicable to predict crime. Yes, you can use that in that manner, but it can also be used to audit the state. It can also be used to essentially seek out biases. So it kind of empowers people. So this democratization of AI technologies, I think is key.
Neal, do you have any thoughts from your vantage point?
Just very briefly, and I'm also curious what Carolina thinks about what we've been talking about. But one thing I would say is, one thing I touched on in this criminal justice example is with the same data, there are different ways you can formulate the problem, and that is sort of where things can go right or wrong. The assumption with predictive policing is often that it's this minority report thing, right? You're predicting a geographic area and sending police there to police it more. This is not what NYPD does, actually. So they use the same kind of data, but they have a recommendation engine. So what they're trying to do is find crime patterns. And this is not statistical patterns. This is a term of art in law enforcement, where they're trying to find related crimes by serial offenders. And these crimes can be, especially like burglary, grand larceny, and some third one, robbery or something like that. And they use machine learning models to try to find related crimes, and they're related in MO, time, or space. And that has very different properties to what these geographic kind of systems do. They don't have the same sort of feedback loops. It's got a human in the loop. It's just an assistant to the detective. They interviewed all these guys who find these patterns and so on and so forth. This is also a public system that they built in-house. So you can read an academic refereed paper where the whole model is right there of all of the different features that they use. So this is a bit of a different expectation that people have about the lack of transparency in these systems and the properties that they have. So that's actually not the NYPD system at all, in fact, but to you.
Can I comment on that quickly?
Jump in
please.
quickly.
Yeah, so what I was talking about is not a geographical system.
No,
And you're talking about the patternizer.
I'm just saying in general.
Right. But the issue with what you say, yes, you're right. That's what we need to do. But when you're kind of training models like the one that you're talking about, I read the paper actually. So the issue is someone is sitting down, picking up those features. How do you say that when there's similar MO? What does that mean? That's a human interpretation, which means there is a scope of injecting bias.
Sure, I'm not defending the particular system. I'm just saying that there's a range of different designs of these systems, and they're a bit different from what tends to dominate the conversation in predictive policing. That's all.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So I'm happy to jump in here. So I actually want to sort of bring in a conversation I had over lunch. So sort of thinking of, guardrails and safeguards, one of the recommendations that, I had in my paper was this notion of, prior to the deployment of these, AI-based solutions, actually sort of engaging with our local communities in a debate about, what we are intending to deploy, with what purpose, and what impact it may have on them. We've seen, in the case of Brazil is, I think a good example of, policymakers making this effort to sort of consult experts prior to, the adoption of regulation or deployment of certain technologies. They tend to have these like multi-stakeholder consultations, which I think are really great. But it's going a step further and actually like engaging people directly impacted by the deployment of some of these technologies. So in the case of Buenos Aires, perhaps the police forces speaking more openly, in the news about their intention to come up with this program, doing focus groups, consultations with passengers of the public transport system where these systems were being deployed, and I think that would have helped them also understand the fears of people. When these systems get deployed, the fact that, say I want to go to a protest, I may decide not to go if I know I'm being recorded, right? So it's a form of self-censorship that's affecting my, maybe freedom of expression is affecting my, freedom of, free association and assembly. And it helps the system come in contact with sort of the concerns of the community. And also for the community, it also sort of serves to build trust, which I think it's, a bit of a, I think it answers a little bit sort of this issue that we're discussing here, this notion of, everyone having buy-in basically on whatever it is decided to get deployed.
Right, Ishanu's mentioning receiving hate mail, for example. So
It was very, very nicely worded.
eloquent hate mail, apparently.
Yes. So I have a question. Can I ask? Okay.
Jump in, please.
So, the way I think about it is, yes, it looks kind of ominous when the government puts a camera on top of you, right? But then there's Uber. I'm mispronouncing it. I always mispronounce that. The car company, right? People are getting rides on that, and all of that information is logged somewhere, right? So really, the government really doesn't have to put cameras in buses. If they really want to track people, they would just make that company hand over the data. They will know exactly where everyone is going, what their habits are, where they have been. It will be trivial, really, to do things like that.
Right.
Right. So.
But probably.
Yeah.
Completely
I'm
wrong
just saying. I'm agreeing with you. I'm saying that
Right.
the problem is way more, and not even just that, people are putting cameras there. It's just, and it's hard to imagine for me. Maybe you can think about it more. Like how there's no way of putting that back. I mean, do we not want to have like nice things? Do we not want to have cars and like which we can call from our cell phone? Maybe we do, or maybe I don't know. So that's an interesting question.
Yeah,
but once you have that, then you have this massive data.
Right.
Pretty much, the guys in Uber can tell exactly where you want, what you do, what your habits are, where you are going, where you would want to go. All of that can be done very easily. Now you're kind of depending on a private company not handing over the data to the government, which is, we know that doesn't work, right?
Right. So let's see. I think just thinking of how I react to that. So the example you're giving actually sort of resonates with things I've read about how data sharing works, for instance, in the context of China, right? Where there is some form sometimes of data sharing between private companies and the state. I think Latin America, going back to sort of the focus of my paper, is really far from resorting to that type of sort of data collection practices. And I think the risk with the use of facial recognition for policing is basically the possibility of running into or enabling forms of mass surveillance by the state, right? And I think in the case of the pilot of Buenos Aires, we saw what it means, right, for those deployments to go wrong with this, allegations that it had indeed been used to track, human rights activists and basically political figures. So, going to the question, that I put out to the audience, this notion of like, can we put the genie back in the bottle? Well, ideally, we want to deploy the technologies having, build the proper safeguards. Again, that's why I insist, Latin America is in a worst case scenario, because we found ourselves in this, bad situation of not being able to put the genie back in the bottle, and possibly, we'll have to basically move towards, asking for moratoriums on the use of the technology until we can work on that. And that's not an ideal situation. So I think, the message to the audience today has to be, I believe, and I'm happy to hear your thoughts, guys, on this. It's deploying AI for policing is incredibly complex. And it needs to be very, carefully thought through when you approach the use of the technology. You need to work on building the safeguards. You need to work on engaging impacted communities. You need to understand the human rights impacts of, the deployments, and I think that should be always the starting point.
Can I ask a...
Sorry, should we do some Q&A? I'm just curious what the audience thinks of that.
Sure.
Please.
Can I ask one question quickly? And then, yes, please do think of your questions. We should move to Q&A. I was just curious if you have a sense in an ideal world of who should police the police's use of AI.
AI.
AI?
AI should do that. I agree completely
Fight
with what you're
tech with
saying.
tech.
But the issue is, do you think building safeguard, we're saying that let's put some rules and let's hope that the people, the really powerful people, are going to all obey them. Are we that naive?
Neal, your thoughts?
I mean, I think a lot of these problems about AI are not about AI. I mean, if you're concerned about the police's use of AI, are you concerned about the AI or are you concerned about the police? And often these are sort of proxy battles about people's lack of trust in the police, period. I mean, one of the problems with NYPD, for instance, is that they are not very accountable to anybody. They are not particularly accountable to the public. They are not accountable to the mayor. They're not accountable to their own commissioner. The previous speaker mentioned things about, it's important for law enforcement to be part of the community, not just policing the community. They're not a part of the community. They live in the suburbs on Long Island. They don't live in New York City, a lot of them. So those are more fundamental problems. If I had a wave a magic wand and change things about the police department, taking away the AI tools is not the top of my list.
Mm-hmm.
I agree.
Do we have any questions in the audience? If you could walk up to the mic there. Anybody? Any questions? Carolina, do you have thoughts in the meantime on who should
Well,
policing?
for me, it's when I look again at the case studies that I analyzed, civil society was so incredible in really creating these deployments, submitting access to information requests to understand the effectiveness of the systems. So I think I do trust society, particularly civil society, can play that role, and I do have faith in the system providing those checks and balances. But yeah.
Can we take a question from the audience?
Larry Birnbaum, Northwestern University. I think just on this last point, the privacy thing is in general not just about AI, as you said, and I think for many of us in this room, we're lucky enough to live in a place where we're not that concerned with what the government is tracking about us, and we're much more concerned with what marketers and advertisers want to know about us, because they can make a lot of money knowing very intimate things. And so that's really the main thing I think most of us are probably thinking about. I think two things to say. First, this thing focused almost only on policing, and I'd be curious to hear what people think about other aspects of public safety, fire, or sort of just broken infrastructure that causes injuries and things like that might be kind of relevant to this thing. But the other thing to say is, like, what work is going on in tracking this? And I don't just mean tracking it in terms of empirically, like what are the deployments that are happening, although I think that's going to be important. Like, where is this being deployed now, and what are the impacts of it just around the world? But also, what kind of technological tools can be built to track the impact of these things, to actually develop some empirical basis for understanding, what is the impact? Now, I'm not thinking about A/B testing, although A/B testing might actually be a thing to do. But in general, I just think having some broader base of data about, how badly are these things confirming known biases, or how much can those be mitigated? I think are going to be, going forward, that's going to be the way to actually make progress here, is to actually get some information about that.
So two questions there, one on sort of other uses of AI in helping public safety, and one on sort of how to measure success.
Yeah, on the second point of how to measure success, I think this is related to like a broad public sector issue around AI that is not even specific to public safety, which is the use of vendors, external vendors, and procurement mechanisms. And they don't work very well for AI systems for a number of different reasons. So one reason is that they're used to buying a thing like Excel, and then you have Excel. But AI systems don't work like that. They can change over time, and the performance can degrade. So you need some mechanism for sort of clawing back a thing, maybe 2 years after you bought it. Sometimes you buy a thing and it doesn't work. There are systems like this for like sepsis detection in hospitals. The thing just does not do what you expect it to do. The reason NYPD outsources some of its technology development, not Patternizer, but a lot of other things, is because of the pension system, actually. It's like very expensive for them to hire people in-house to do some of this, so they just outsource it. So these systems are not transparent even to them. Forget about the issue of them being transparent on their use with the public. They know this, but to fix that, you need civil service hiring reform, you need pension reform. These things don't involve technology and don't involve AI. So the problem is often somewhere. It's not an ideological objection in many cases, and it's not a technical issue. The problem is somewhere else. It's in things like the pension system. And I'm not saying people should get pensions and there shouldn't be unions or anything like that, but there are really real problems in those places, and really need to think about new models of procurement and what the relationship with external vendors is, because those are the cases where it's least clear, whether it's predictive policing, facial recognition, whatever else, of what is going on.
Absolutely. So I second all of that. And I wanted to actually reflect on the other question about other uses of AI for public safety. Really to sort of reflect on the one point. I think in the case of Latin America, and we discussed, I think, earlier in the sessions today, the question of politics, right? So in the case of Latin America, my sense is a lot of mayors are considering the use of facial recognition because they want to show to their constituencies that they are, engaging in efforts to modernize the state, right? And it's, we're using technology for policing, or, I wish there was sort of a broader vision, for these policymakers, that technology can actually be used for public safety purposes beyond, facial recognition that's actually, what's become like really popular in Latin America. What I will say tied to that as well is that Latin America is being targeted also by companies that sell surveillance technology as a potential market. So the reason why we're seeing uptake also has to do with the fact that there's very active efforts to sell this technology in the region, and that's also a critical driver, and something for us to consider as well. Yeah.
So I'll just add to that. So when you talk about other uses of AI and you give some examples, like security and safety issues, I'll just give one example that is, without AI being developed further and deployed not in a sense of crime, we would have no chance of averting the next pandemic. If we have to not go through what we went through in 2019 and lost 20 million people globally, the only way to do that would be to have biosurveillance that is essentially driven by AI. Otherwise, currently what we do is we spend billions of dollars. We go and collect strain sequences from bats and pangolins and whatever, and stick them in the fridge. We have no idea which ones are more dangerous and which one is going to kill the next 20 million people or worse.
So that's a more positive note to end the session on.
Yeah.
Thank you all for joining us, and please join me in giving a round of applause.